Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for being here today. My name is Filippo Santoni Desio. I'm an associate professor at Ethics and Technology Department here at TU Delft. And a warm welcome to this episode of Prometheus Problems. So as you know, in this series of meetings, we discuss questions of broader interest, societal interest for engineering students and beyond. Today we're talking politics, which is always a timely topic to discuss, but even more so due to the next local elections of this weekend. So the topic of today is, do we need engineers or more engineers in politics? And to discuss this topic today, we have invited three guests, starting from the one who has come the longest way, all the way from Tilburg, Professor Herman de Recht, who is Associate Professor in Philosophy of Science at Tilburg University. Welcome, Herman. And then getting closer to Delft, actually working in Delft as an Associate Professor at the Multimedia Computing Department, Cynthia Lim, who is also, as she will say, also a professional musician, a pianist. And to my left, Twan de Nijs, who is a student here in Delft in EPA, but also has been working at the City Council as a representative of the students in politics. So first of all, I would like to also to talk to you as audiences in this event, and I would like to hear from you what you think about the question. What would be your first reaction to the question, do we need more engineers in politics? Could you please raise your hand if you believe that yes, we do need more engineers in politics? Let me first also ask those who would like to say no, just to check, since let's make a fair election. And could you please raise your hand if you believe that no, we have enough or we don't need more engineers in politics? Just for the sake of, you know. All right, so let's hear someone who raised their hand for the yes.
Well, for the yes, it's a mix of the answer. My name is Melanie Ordewald, and I'm also in the local board of the municipality active. And I'm an engineer as well, and I would say, do we need more engineers in policy making?
Right.
And that's my nuances. I think we need a lot of more engineering at the top of the government. And also in politics, but especially in policy making, because I think there's a lack of engineers in the top of the government, and therefore we are missing sometimes signals from the lower engineering task forces, from the municipality and also the state government to make things work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can there anybody please take the position against that? Thank you so much.
Yeah, because I still don't know how I feel about this question. I have not formed an opinion about it. But the reason why there is also an against is I feel like politics is really about stories, about convincing people, and engineers are more about facts and looking at the numbers. And even though that's important in executing the task,
right,
in envisioning it or having dreams or
so politics is about big visions and not about calculations or
something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. All right, then this seems quite of a good starter for the conversation, but to get more substance to the conversation, let's hear what our speakers have to say about it. And our first speaker is Professor Herman de Recht.
Okay.
The floor is yours, Herman.
Okay, thank you, Filippo. Thank you for inviting me. I got 10 minutes allotted to me, and there's a lot to say about whether there should be more engineers in politics. But I'm going to briefly give my argument, and then, if there's time, I can give you examples. Hopefully a more stronger and substantive argument. But for now, I just want to show you how you can argue for a positive answer, a confirmative answer to the question, do we need more engineers in politics? So I'm going to divide my 10 minutes in 4 parts. First, I'll briefly talk about politics, of course, and then I'll talk about science. And I hope you can see that there's a logical order in my theme. So I'll talk about politics and science, and then politics and science and decisions. What I'll do is I'll try not to refer too many times to the details of the argument, but basically the argument that I'm going to present is based on the work of a number of so-called American pragmatists. And the founding father of pragmatism, if there is something like a founding father of pragmatism, is Charles Peirce. But I'll mainly refer to John Dewey's work without further mentioning John Dewey. Okay. So first, let's see, what can we say about politics? So I'll keep it as simple as possible. I think we don't need more than this to make the argument that it would be a good thing for politics to have more engineers participating in it. So first of all, what is a political context? What kind of political context are we talking about? There's lots of different political contexts that you can talk about. I'll simply take for granted that we talk about democracy, one person, one vote, majority decisions, check and balances in our democracy, etc. The kind of democracy that we have in the Netherlands. Okay? And then the main question for politics, of course, is what we, as citizens or people from the Netherlands, what we want to strive for. Right? And if you ask that question, what do we want to strive for, then the only thing that we can intelligently say is that we are performing this huge social experiment, and in that experiment we are learning what we ought to strive for, and that takes us to ethics. So ethics is important. What do we ought to strive for? And given the history of, let's say, the Dutch democracy, you can say that we gradually go from contingent, arbitrary aims to democratic norms that we actually want to uphold. Now, these norms can never be categorical. That is to say, these norms are always conditional or hypothetical or tentative. We are in a continuing social experiment. And so, given that these norms are conditional, have the character of being hypothetical and tentative, that's why science comes in, right? So, in politics, given this political context, we try to decide what we want, and we learn what we ought to want. Once we know what we ought to want, what the goals and aims are that we set ourselves, we use science in order to realize those goals, or to get to those goals, or to realize those aims in the most effective way. Okay? So that's where science comes in. Science tells you how to realize those aims that we set ourselves. So then we get to science. So what is science? Now normally, to our students at Tilburg University, I teach a long course on what science is. Today I only have 2 minutes to tell you what science is, I think. So science, what is it? And I think that there's a huge misconception about what science is. So normally science is taken to be that, that fulfillment that we feel when we long for knowledge and we get knowledge. Right? That's the kind of standard way of understanding what science is. That is not the way that we ought to understand science, I would argue. And maybe I can give you the argument later in the discussion. So science is, to me, a way to detect how our actions, how these are linked, so to speak, to achieving the goals that we have learned to be worth pursuing. And so science is basically an activity of exploration. And I mean, with science, I mean all the different kinds of sciences, including technology, including the social sciences, including physics. So it's an exploration of what would do the trick. If this is the aim that we strive for, if this is the goal we want to realize, here's how we now think you can do it. Right? Okay. So science then emerges as not as a representative mirror of the deeper structures of the universe, but it emerges as an instrument, a tool that you can use. A tool that you can use, and therefore we need engineers, because engineers are of course specialized. They are experts in the use of the technological knowledge that we have gathered and discovered. So that's why we need engineers. So if we combine these two, politics on the one hand, science on the other hand, then the role of any scientist really in politics, not just engineers, but any scientist, is to give us input for how to realize the aims that we set ourselves. The role of any scientist, including engineers, in politics is to give us input for determining what aims we ought to strive for. The role of any scientist, including engineers, in politics is to give us input for decision making or decision context design in political frameworks, right? Okay. Again, there's a picture of Richard Rorty there. He's one of the most recent American pragmatists that try to argue along these lines. 2 more minutes. So now, what about politics and science and decisions? So here's really my concern. My concern is not so much, do we need engineers in politics? Of course we need engineers in politics. We need all kinds of expertise in politics. So my concern is rather, how do we get those engineers into politics, right? And here I go back to the work of the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who was one of the first philosophers arguing that humans tick depending on what they feel. And so the first way to get engineers involved in politics is to let them feel that they are needed. It's to let them feel that there are problems that they can contribute to with their technology, with their expertise. So that's the feel of a commitment. How can you get an engineer to feel a commitment to a larger project, if you want, social project, a social experiment that we are currently performing? So how do we get engineers to feel this commitment? And here's something, and I admit this is a pet idea, because what I try to do, not just for our own students, but what I try to defend for academia as such, is to show that any curriculum, any educational program for engineers ought not just focus on knowledge transfer, not just on skills training, but also on academic character development. So what we need to discover is how we can get students much more committed to the idea that their expertise ultimately, without, outside the walls of the university, will count or can count. And then lastly, how to inform engineers about decision-making context. So what I think is an interesting development at the technical universities is that there's now a new way of trying to come up with technology in such a way that we can more optimally design decision context given what we know about people from psychological science. So what we can do is we can actually design the context of decision making, right? So there's a certain kind of policy, there's a certain kind of aim or goal that we set ourselves. We want to realize those goals. How are we going to do that? Obviously, we need to decide how to do that. Well, those contexts of decision making ought to be designed in the right way so that we get the right kind of decisions. And I think that this is a time where engineers, a new brand of engineers, can actually contribute to the decision context design. But that means, and this is the point that I'd like to defend this afternoon, if you accept all this, a big if, but if you accept all this, I would say that it is important for engineers as well, to know about cognitive psychology, to know enough about psychology, that is the mind of human beings, to understand how you can make your expertise count in the discussions and context that you will encounter once you leave this campus. And so that's kind of my hope, right? That we can introduce, let's say, cognitive psychology, elementary cognitive psychology, into the educational program of engineers here at Delft University as well. So that's kind of my hope, really. So I've written a piece on academic character development, and I think that Willard Quine is the one philosopher that you really need to understand in order to see that psychology is, even to engineers, is really, really important. That's it, really. Yeah, this is the problem, I guess. And this problem, so this cartoon shows you what the problem is, and that you can only solve this if you know enough psychology, right? So even the best technological knowledge that you have will not solve this problem for an engineer encountering other people dealing with politics, right? Okay. That's it. This is an example that I didn't discuss. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Herman. So perfect in time. Thank you.
Thank you.
So shall we take 5 minutes just to ask, in case there are burning questions or curiosities,
Sure.
to be asked to Herman, and then we move to Cynthia and Tuan. Any thing you really want to ask right now before we move to the next speaker? We do have time for that. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Marnix. I had one question. So it's engineers who has to know a little bit of psychology.
Yeah.
Would you say alpha people, like people who studied psychology, do they also need to know some of the skills, knowledge that engineers have? Does it need to go backward as well?
Well, that you're absolutely right. So that will be an ideal world, right? So, for instance, let me only speak of my own alma mater, the place where I work, Tilburg University. We have a huge influx of psychology students. I would really like to see them have the kind of elementary knowledge about technology, just like we hope to give you the basics of psychology. Yeah, especially cognitive psychology. Yeah. Yeah, so what we do, so what I do, for instance, when I teach philosophy of science, is basically try to show them that science is a technique, is a tool, and that they should talk to engineers if they want to know more about technology as a tool to try to realize what we all want, or what the majority wants. That's the problem of democracy, of course, but that's a different problem. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Any other question to Herman?
Yeah, I always get the feeling like everyone wants everyone to learn everything.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, we need to learn ethics, and we need to learn philosophy and cognitive psychology and linguistic skills, and you need to be really critical, of course, what there is possible in 3 years.
Yep.
So is this the first thing you think should be added to an engineering curriculum, or is ethics even more important, or if you're really critical about it?
If I'm really critical about it, but this has to do with what my stance is towards ethics, and that's something I need to discuss with Filippo maybe first, but I would say that cognitive psychology is more important than ethics. Right? And the thing that I'd like to add is that if you take the idea seriously of academic character development, then first you need the basics, right? And to offend ethicists present here even more,
go ahead, no problem.
I don't think there's any consensus in ethics that might help engineers tackling the problems that they will confront when they go outside of the university.
May I quickly reply to this before I give you the floor? I felt we were called into...
They thought they were safe, but they're not.
No, but you go with your question first, and then I will go later. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm Emily, and I was wondering, you said like every technical student should do cognitive psychology, but as said, in 3 years, not everything is possible.
Yeah.
Isn't it more important to have a range, so some people who are more on the technical side, but also a group in the middle? Because I do agree that the group in the middle is not really there right now, but that it would be more important to have a group between beta and alpha to make the communication also better in politics between the two groups, because they're very separated right now.
Yeah, yeah. So we are still dealing with this two cultures problem, right? The one that Snow identified as, you know, people who don't know anything about technique and people who don't know anything about Shakespeare. So we need to have more people in the middle, as you say. Yeah, I think so. And one of the reasons why it's so difficult for us to do that as universities is because they took away a whole year of educational program time, right? Give it back. So as a society, so this would be my call for politicians to, you know, take the right decisions, a better decision than they did last time, and give us back that 1 year of academic education. So you're absolutely sure you need time to do this, right? Give students that time.
Can I quickly ask you a 30-second question before we move to Cynthia? Because I'm very curious also to hear from you and Antoine. But so you started by saying something I very much share, which is that politics is about finding out what we want and what we ought to want, etc. Mm-hmm. And then the last remark about the role of engineering cognitive psychology may be read, maybe it's not your intention, but may be read in this way. Engineers know how things work, and they just need to know how the human mind works in order to convince people that they are right.
Yeah.
Which seems to me to conflict with the starting point, which is that we don't know what is right, and we need to discuss it.
Yeah, sure. But even after very long discussion, you still don't know what is right.
Right.
Exactly. So, so we have majority decisions. That's how it works, right? So yes, it is important for engineers to understand the human mind, right? Maybe not to the extent that psychologists try to understand the human mind, but just enough to understand their own minds.
Right.
So it's not just understanding what the minds are of other people, but also their own minds, so that they know about rhetorics, about nudging, framing, biases, and things like that. And I think that's kind of the basic things that you need to learn as an engineer before you go out into the world and discuss things with people that have a completely different background.
Right, so understanding their own mind, not only the mind of others.
Yeah, both.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So also your own biases, etc., etc.
Absolutely,
okay, that makes much more sense.
You know, like biases like overconfidence and things like that. Yeah, you need to know that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We will get back to you in the second part of the discussion, but now we are very curious to hear from Cynthia Lim.
Thank
Floor
you.
is yours, Cynthia.
Yes, well, I can actually nicely position myself maybe in this debate that we just had. So as discussed, I might even embody the two cultures in some sense. I've been trained as a concert pianist. And it's really interesting from that background to see how people react to you if you tell them that. They get really excited. And they say things like, oh, it's so nice, I play the piano too. They haven't even been at conservatoire, but they immediately feel like they can engage with me. And frankly spoken, I can have really nice discussions with them about music. Absolutely true. Now, take in my other identity, that of a computer scientist. The reactions are quite a bit more awkward there. Oh, you do something with computers. Can you check my machine? It's really slow. Can you fix it? I've been making jokes about this, that my sister has a bachelor in civil engineering and they never ask her to fix the kitchen sink, which would be about the same metaphorical level of asking me to do something like this. Yes, I know something about computers, but not that. And when I try to tell people what I actually do with computers, I work on search engines and recommender systems, so many information filtering questions, they immediately disengage. I'm sorry, I'm not so technical, I'm really bad at math, that's really hard. We leave it at your side. And that is a problem if we speak policy, if we speak politics, and currently the digital transformation that we see. Because many of our services are becoming digital. Much of our life is turning digital. Politicians need to make decisions based on that. Our whole government runs on this. And we don't see it, we don't feel it. The people who are not in our ballpark don't want to engage. And then when it gets into the news, yeah, it's not very great. There is this bad computer malfunctioning at the prosecution office. The tax collection systems, there are 600 IT systems, we don't understand them. Municipalities have issues with software leaks. There is ransomware, our whole society is derailed. Our data got sold when GGD was doing the corona checks. Schiphol broke down because of a software bug in scheduling what part a train should go to. And lately also the more discriminatory effects of data-driven decision-making. There was this big childcare benefit scandal we also had, which partially was driven by data-driven decision-making. Now, in 10 minutes, I can't tell you the full breakdown of this story. Actually, I was the first technical commenter on this in Trouw last year. If you're interested, Tuesday next week, I give a talk on the other side of this campus on that. So approach me if you want to hear more about that. But in this story, speaking about policy politics and my particular domain take, I want to emphasize how tricky it is if people don't really know what they're talking about. And especially if I stand on this last part, having data, having something digital, needing to do decision making, it's a political decision ultimately, but we seem to be able to frame it in what we teach our computer science students. And what I've seen as a technical person is that in public discourse, these terms, it's Babylonic. People speak about algorithms, systems, AI, and robots as if they are the same things. To me, they very much are not. But if people talk about that, you kind of guess what they're speaking about if they ask you about this. But it is a problem if you have to be precise. It is a problem if we speak about regulation, or if we ask people to be accountable for what they're exactly doing. Just for this concept of algorithm, to a computer scientist, an algorithm is a series of procedures that in principle can be executed by a computer. Often we design that as computer scientists for abstraction and for scalability. Algorithms are not always smart. I mean, in the current day discourse, it seems that they are things that just deliberately go tell people that they are fraudsters. But if you are in the first year of a computer science course, actually you get that as a course, algorithms and data structures. You learn about problems you can solve with algorithms. And one of the most classical problems there is sorting. If I have different numbers, how do I put them in order? Well, there are many potential strategies you can think about it. If I have, let's say, 3 blocks with numbers, one algorithm, one procedure could be throw them in the air, let them fall on the ground, figure out if they are in order, if not, start over again until they are in order. That is an algorithm, a super dumb and very inefficient algorithm. For 3 blocks, maybe with a few tries, I'll get there. If there are 10 blocks, it gets more tricky. If there are 1,000, I have a problem. So that's not the type of strategies you want to design. But if I then designed this better strategy, like get the higher or the lower numbers first to either side, and maybe in that sort them more, such strategies are strategies we think of as computer scientists. And if we can fix that for numbers, we can actually also use it on anything else we can put an order on. If I can do it with numbers, I can do that with letters as well. So that's this abstracted take that we take, but it's also often what other people find very hard to comprehend. But if I speak about these algorithms we see a lot in public discourse these days, more about machine learning, more about making decisions based on data, you go more to these types of spaces. I measure something, I might have 2 classes, blue and red, and I want to distinguish between them. Or if I have a null point, figure out if it might have been red or blue. If I have a distribution like this, my strategy can be easy. I can almost draw a line there, it's fine. If my data looks more like that, it gets more tricky. I cannot draw straight lines anymore. I have to do something different. I have to use other algorithms to be able to distinguish between those. At least if I don't want to mistake too many reds or blues for one another. And that's what, in my technical world, people are doing. They figure out these algorithms, they come up with all these different procedures, and you can take any of these off the shelf to make your decisions. That's what, in principle, our people do. That is not necessarily what policy is about. And if these 2 worlds conflict, I get interesting questions. So as someone who did a lot of public speaking, I was asked to comment in workshops that spoke about exclusion by automated systems such as algorithms and AI. Algorithms maybe are things that also are used in AI that may end up in systems, but what is this that we talk about? Can you explain how the YouTube algorithm exactly works, I got? in a Universiteit van Nederland film. I had 5 minutes to explain that. Come on, the YouTube algorithm. There is no such thing like the YouTube algorithm. And can you walk us through the steps if we have machine learning code? I was asked that for a radio bulletin. And I told people, well, I can do that, but I don't think that's what you want to hear. So, the equivalent to can you walk us through these steps in the code, if I think of these procedures, it's almost the same as asking someone to walk you through the inner workings of an air fryer if you're cooking. We have a particular technique, it helps us to reach a particular goal, but you don't have to be an air fryer engineer to make healthy eating choices or to make a dish that's reasonable. And that's much more, I think, the level we should talk about in these discussions. Think more of algorithms, as we discussed today, as recipes, but think more about the dishes that you want to make, the ingredients that go in. Because even if the air fryer is perfect, you're probably not necessarily guaranteed to get your perfect dish out of there. So as for me, what I want to pose down is that engineers in politics, maybe it's nice, but I would especially like to argue to have more engineering literacy in politicians. So we actually had the discussion just before. Systems perspectives are important. I know many people who are not engineers find this really hard. But when we combine this with digital topics, we really typically address points that are difficult, that organizations themselves do not really understand. Maybe wicked societal problems. None of us knows what it is. We can measure something of it. Whether we actually want to predict for it, we don't even know. And maybe it's even fine because these problems are so complex. Engineers can address that, but they need to know where to go. And if I even take that cooking metaphor, the government, the policymakers, I see them more as the restaurant managers than the cooks. They need to figure out what menus to take, what they want to serve to their customers. And then they can talk to people who make air fryers, and they should definitely engage. And there should be other things in air fryers probably too. But it's a different type of role with maybe a different type of skill set. I also really want to argue to stimulate more people to engage and dare engage in these discussions. I'm really annoyed that people always back out. It's kind of nice to start as a musician and then you talk about recommending music and then I can get them into these discussions, but it shouldn't only be me who can do that. There should be more entrances, people should be able to do this. And I think a big role for us, more broadly, also the engineers getting trained here or those interested, get people to ask better questions, figure out what we are speaking about. I've really seen when media ask me for appearances, they're afraid of the technical too. They don't want to engage then. I have to talk in very, very simple language, and then you conflate everything. So for those who read Dutch, I can really recommend a friend of mine, Ilyas Nasrullah, who writes columns for Trouw these days, every 2 weeks, on digital affairs, because, like me, he was really annoyed at the lack of literacy he saw when people asked him for solutions and consultancy on it. But I think in terms of policy, politics, engaging, and my take as a digital engineer, that's what I would recommend. Thank you very much, and happy to engage in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And this is really music for our ears as philosophers, that you want conceptual clarity.
Yeah.
All right, questions to Cynthia? Anybody? Yes, that's the gentleman.
So, my name is Richard. Great talk, by the way. So we heard in the first talk about how the real question is really, how do we get engineers into politics? And not do we need engineers in politics? So my question to you as well, if we need this engineering literacy in politics, how do we actually get it there?
I think there are several ways to it. So actually these types of public appearances, also if you get them a bit closer to policymakers, they help a lot. And I know that I myself have been visible. Some political parties actually asked me for master classes. This is a way to get in, but you really need to then not teach them like you teach the people here. You really need to deliberately reshape that. I think it's a good start, because waiting until our Delft engineers are up to getting there, it's a few more years. I mean, getting them interested now is another parallel track we should take, I think. But we're only going to see that in 5 years, 10 years from now, apart from maybe in the municipal council. But for the rest, it's going to take a while. Yeah, so I think we should approach it in different ways, and also generally spoken, indeed, in terms of visibility, maybe even for Delft itself, being quite aware of how we publicly present ourselves, or influence a bit how that narrative now goes. Because as I said, the technical really feels like something people cannot grasp or understand, and digital is scary, you can touch it. So that whole sci-fi framing around this, it really doesn't help. And maybe we can also much more deliberately frame and present in other ways there to show it actually is about topics everyone can have a say in.
When you give your master classes, do you have the idea that sort of the people there understand broadly what you're talking about, or is
Yes.
it very difficult to get across?
No, it's actually not difficult, but I have to approach it like a musician. So indeed, I have to first talk a lot about music, and then they understand me, and then typically I talk about measurability, and I talk about notes in music, and then interpretations that are not the same as notes. So it's kind of a philosophical type of discussion, but people recognize that. And from there, it's then rather easy to go into data science. So for me, that has been an entrance that worked, and that worked well, because people naturally engage with these music topics. But I think we should be able to do other entrances too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions for Cynthia? Anybody? Yeah, this one here.
Thank you very much for presenting this. Algorithms is really a topic that is on the politics agenda for policymakers and politicians. And the general perspective was, first of all, that the algorithms were neutral, and you were quite well defined how it worked. But how do you think that this will develop, and how do we get more attention that it is not neutral, and that there is ethics behind it, and that there's decision making behind it?
So for me, currently, the best metaphor I found there was this recipe metaphor. I've tried a few other things that didn't land as well. The thing is, if I give you the recipe to my favorite pasta dish, and I tell you to exactly replicate it, it's an objective set of instructions you can objectively replicate. You may really dislike my dish. That's fine, but you can replicate the outcome. So this is, I think, in terms of the neutrality of algorithms, the difference, that we search for an outcome. That is a normative question where you weigh things in different ways. Even how you optimize internally, another normative choice. If you want to be fair to people, at the individual or the group level, mathematically those definitions counteract each other. You can't be fair to everyone at the same time. You just cannot. So someone should take a stance there. And this is where currently I'm a bit worried that then they are kind of often shifting it to us, like, you can optimize for something, now it's optimal because it's numbers. Yeah, but according to a particular criterion we chose to optimize for. And we've seen the same in search engines, recommender systems. A very easy way of measuring engagement is that many people quickly click on something, but then clickbait is the best possible content you can ever get in the world. And we've seen our information systems shaping themselves accordingly, and I think we're now at the point that we think that's not the only way of showing information to people. So just showing these examples that taking a choice actually has consequences people recognize. And coming back to that, I think that literacy is slowly growing now, but we now need to grasp it.
It's time for one additional quick question to Cynthia before we move to Tuan. Anybody? All right, then let's move to Tuan, who is the living example that you can be an engineering student and a politician somehow, or at least someone really interested in politics. Tuan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. As the only one, I didn't prepare any slides, which allows me to be nice and dynamic. I don't have to click anything. But that was, of course, not how we always did things in politics. As a former city council member for STIP, Students of Technology in Politics, you really are confronted with the differences that are present between engineers or an engineering training and non-engineers. You also realize that there is a balance. We are engineers in politics. We are engineers that are interested in politics. That does not mean that every engineer that walks around here at the TU Delft is interested in politics. You might want to draw them in, but you first need an affinity as well, which we've really noticed when you try to draw in more engineers in politics. But I believe that in Delft we've been quite successful. Not only is Delft now the second party in the city council, which means that there are 6 engineers in training in the city council, but as Melanie is already nodding, Delft is a city that has the benefit of many people with a technical background, and I believe you can sometimes already see the difference. I don't know the exact numbers because I didn't count the people beforehand, but I would dare to say that in the city council here in Delft, the total number of people with a technical background might be higher than the one in the parliament in The Hague, because that's simply the composition of Delft, and I think, of course, STIP has contributed quite nicely to that. And you can really see the differences. If you look at the way we approach something like data privacy in Delft, you can really see that Delft takes a front role. They try to approach it in a different way, and I think the people with a technical background have been essential in putting that on the political agenda. Because the complaint with issues like this has often been that policy is years and years behind on what is actually happening, on the innovations that companies and knowledge institutes like the TU Delft would really see implemented in society are really being held back by policy and by policymakers that do not understand these technologies yet and first need to be educated before they can be successfully implemented. And as engineer, you are solution driven, so you care more about that solution actually being implemented than waiting for the regulations, which is often a struggle when you look at data privacy, when people are just developing the technology without the proper regulations in place, and then you are dragging behind, and you get there when you're too late. When you have the big behemoths like Twitter and Facebook already deciding how we get our information before we've had critical thinking from policymakers about how this should actually work. So how do we change this? I think that is what the discussion is about today. The question that is posed is quite binary. Do we need more engineers? I think it's already become more clear that you need more technical thinking in politics. You need to have more knowledge of how it works. And of course, an easy answer to that is adding people with a technical background, which is engineers, to politics. But as I started off my talk, you need a balance for this. Because you need people who enjoy the political game. And we have a lot of those in Dutch politics. People who've studied law, who like reading every single letter. And that balance is shifted a lot to that side. I think people with a technical background, they are more interested in how the system works, implementing the right solutions, and they can get quite disturbed by the way the system functions, by the games. Which is, and then you beg the question, you might want more engineers in politics, but do they want to be in politics? Because it's...
And are they invited to be in politics?
Yeah, that is also an important question. So that is what the first presentation was about, I think, inviting them more to be into politics by maybe giving them a skill and see how that is appreciated by society. But also, there's such a shortage for people with a technical background in society as a whole. Why would they go into politics? It's not the first job at the top of the list if you look at TU Delft graduates, because there are many opportunities, and the reward needs to be clear. So you need people who want to contribute. This needs to be intrinsic in a way. And as you might have noticed, my thoughts about this are not organized as of yet, because it is a difficult question. There are a lot of different factors to consider, and I can only share with you my experience. My experience as a city council member for 2 years was that we have a positive contribution to the political process as people with a technical background. You have a clearer overview or a more instinctive overview of how a system functions. You have an analytical approach, you go look for the best solution, and you can be critical when it goes about technical issues such as data. You understand what the experts are saying because you are more familiar with the subject, you have affinity. But it's also, you have an affinity with the issues that these experts face, that they don't get their knowledge communicated to the decision makers. You can do all the research, write a big report, but then if you're in the, well, let's make it more concrete. If you're in the auditing committee of the TU Delft, of the municipality of Delft, and you share as the information officer of the organization what the threats are to the organizations and how you're handling it, and most of the faces that are looking at you are a bit blank, you don't feel like your reporting will make a difference. Whether the policies that you need implemented will be implemented because the decision makers are simply not understanding you. And that is something that we could handle in the auditing committee because there are a couple members who do understand the material and can ask the questions that are needed. But it is also, so we've spoken a lot about data, about computers, but it's also about other technological innovations that are developed here at the Knowledge Institutes in Delft. And that has more to do with how are we moving towards a more sustainable future? How do we want to implement new mobility? And there are a lot of pilots that the TU and the Haagse Hogeschool want to implement, but if the policymakers do not understand them, if they don't know what the barriers are, if they don't take those barriers away, those ideas will not be implemented. And that is a barrier that needs to be fought every day. For this, you need technical understanding, and this is also why I believe that in the end, for now, when the other people do not have the engineering knowledge yet, the engineers do need to be in politics, and they will add to the debate in a positive way.
Thank you so much. We still have 5 minutes also for some quick questions to Tuan.
Tuan, thank you. Thank you very much, Tuan. I'm just curious from your personal experience on the city council, how in practice do you transfer your knowledge to those who perhaps do not have the technical background? Are you able to convince other parties, the local parties, or do you get the blank stares or even the hostile, not another know-it-all nerd reaction? And if so, how could we improve that part of communication?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I see your finger. Interesting.
It's an interesting question indeed, and as member of D66, which is a national party, I wrote the local election program, and I did trainings to other election program committees of other cities, and especially about digitalisation and the technical topics that we are discussing here and how to put it on the agenda in their municipality. And then it becomes very complex to make a starting point, but the starting point is really, why is it important to have a knowledge about, for example, the neutrality of algorithms or the decision schemes behind computer systems, or the ethics about would give priority on the street by sensors on the street. If you really are able to make the decisions more back to the ethical parts that are behind it, if you can convince them of that, then you can go back to why the technology behind it is so important. And what we especially do in Delft, because we are in the city council, and I did count sometimes, it's almost half of the people in the Delft municipality board. I do not know the English words so often. But if you try to convince other cities to take up this in their agendas, what really helped is to say, well, we do a program every year to make the budgetary schemes, and actually you should do that also for digitalization, because it's a kind of a, like we chair the budget, but we also have to chair the programs for sharing the data structures, for example, and that helped a lot. That you really see how what you already explained before, that the structures for talking with the privacy officer, that helped a lot. If you put those people on the table a lot, then the knowledge gets bigger.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think the way Cynthia spoke about it as well is you need images. You need to make it approachable. You need to make it understandable for your audience. This happens, of course, in formal debates, that you try and implement examples of what it would mean if certain, when you share your knowledge, you try to make it exemplary for what it could mean to your audience. Because you can keep it very technical, and to us that might be very interesting, but in the end, people are concerned with what it means to them. And I think that's an important part of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm very curious to hear after the break what Herman has to say about that as well. So, but we'll save that for later, I think.
Yes, of course. We still have time after the break, and we also have time for one more question before we go for a quick break. If there is anybody who wants to ask anything to Tuan, please go ahead. Yes, please.
I'm actually the successor of Tuan, but that, by the way. Just a small question, Tuan. Now that you've been in politics and almost are an engineer after your graduation, what would you like to proceed with? Is it more politics? Is it more engineering? Or are you really seeking for a combination?
No.
And if so, where do you hope to find it then?
Yeah, so I'm one of the people who is interested in the between. I have a bachelor's in mechanical engineering, and now I've moved towards technical policy management and engineering and policy analysis, which is the name of my master's. This master's is very much focused on not only learning to build models, but also to understand the ethics, the considerations, the assumptions of those models, and to be able to discuss those in a meaningful way. So I'm really interested in being between those two worlds, because, well, through my years here in Delft, I've really seen the benefit of that position. I'm one of the people who is interested in both, and I think those people need to be represented. And I'm not sure what that will mean in a job kind of way, where I'll be, but that's what I want to apply, and I feel like it's an open space in the market still, so I'll be looking around.
Definitely good luck with that. And we're about to take a small break. After the break, there will be more interaction between the speakers and more opportunity for all of us to discuss. But I guess in order to be fresh for the second part of the discussion, we need at least 10 minutes break. So we start again at 5, 6, 5, 7. I want to be precise. I'm talking to engineers here. All right, see you in 10 minutes. Cheers. All right, I think it's about time to engage with our speakers again, or even better, to have them engaging with each other a bit. So I was curious, Herman, while you were listening to Cynthia's presentation, whether you had any questions or comments on that.
Yeah, sure. So, here's what I took from your presentation, the recipe metaphor that you're so fond of, to see whether I really understand that. So here would be the recipe metaphor. So suppose that within the city of Delft, the city council decides to have, I don't know, there's a certain kind of thing that they really want to have realized within a specific window of time. And then, if that is what they want, they could have chosen lots of other stuff, so to speak. But on the menu, they've picked this one. And so what they now do is they go to Delft University, and they knock on the door of the university, and they simply say, look, this is what we want. You have the expertise. Tell me what to do. Or develop the kind of tool or instrument that helps us to realize what we want to realize. Is that the way that you want to interpret that metaphor? Because on the one hand, I would fully agree with that, because it kind of shows you that if you have some kind of instrument, let it be science, we can discuss this, but let it be science, then one of the ways to approach this is to say that, well, you know, you can use an instrument for many, many kind of things, right? Good things, but also bad things. But your recipe metaphor kind of seems to not address that problem. So here's the city of Delft knocking on the door of engineers. This is what we want. Oh, well then you need to do this, or we'll help you develop the technique to realize that, without any regard whatsoever about what the effects are. But surely you're not implying that.
No, and as for me, the recipe metaphor, I've mostly actually used it more in terms of illustrating this question about how precise, exact, or objective an algorithm is. So mostly in that context. Right. And there I've seen people arguing like, you know, algorithms, they're computers, they don't get tired, they're not biased, they do the same thing all the time, so it's better than humans. But there you can say like, yeah, okay, you can replicate my recipe and you can hate the outcome, right? So here in terms of, because in those discussions, a lot of fundamental questions on human rights, discrimination, etc. are being posed. And you get these discussions in politics like, I don't look at gender and then I'm blind and I never considered it, or I did look at gender because otherwise I cannot know if I discriminated. And in all these discussions, it would to me be more like figuring out whether the ingredients you're trying to put in actually lead to the outcome that you're searching for. And that's where, in terms of responsibility questions, what I see a lot as a computer science educator too, is that now we will go towards regulation. People come to me and say, your people are responsible if this thing will discriminate. Mm-hmm. And then I'm like, well, they should take responsibility. I absolutely agree. But if you ask to cook the wrong thing, it's also on you, right? This is something we should combined figure out. So that's a bit more about the harm. So it's more about the organization that asks for the solution. That solution itself may be challenged or needed to be checked against what you really want as an organization. And that's what I sometimes miss a bit in the discussion on algorithmic accountability, for example.
Yeah.
Okay.
So can I have a quick follow-up on that? Because I'm very interested in the responsibility of engineers and stuff. So I very much like this conversation you're having. And I was wondering to what extent, so we were talking of the scientific education and of politicians, but I was wondering also to what extent you believe that computer scientists, you already partially answered to that, should also have this capacity to ask the right questions to the politicians. If
Absolutely,
politicians come say, I want to realize this, I'm following up a bit of Herman's intention, I believe, how much the computer science should be able to say, hey, but wait a second, are you aware that by doing this, you may obtain that, or you may imply that? Do you think this is also part of the story?
Totally. And this is where the funny thing is, computer scientists already are partially trained to do this when we speak about requirements engineering.
Right.
If they do software engineering, we assume that people asking us for the product don't actually understand computers. And they will ask us to solve the world, and we will say, well, with the budget and the time we have, this is what we can do. Right? So that type of trade-off already is done, where we have processes to quickly check if we are still in each other's line, even though we might come with something that might not completely be what the person asked for. But that type of negotiation, I've seen it much less so yet in the data-driven story, because maybe this perception that if we measure it, it is objective, we don't question that, but then if you then scale it, you amplify the problem you already had. Yeah. And that's really where, on the one hand, I also like the critical work, and I think we should be critical. At the same time, the reality is people will build stuff. Yeah. And then I think it's better that the people who will have to build this stuff don't blindly do it, but go into these discussions.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. And Cynthia, while you were listening to Twan's presentation, did you come up with any questions or comments?
Yeah, Twan, I heard you saying a few times about some people like going into politics, some people do not. And a question we in the search and recommendation world always have is like, is that what already is shown actually also what should be shown, or do we miss something? So here I just wonder, like, are there particular profiles here in Delft in terms of people or expertises that you feel don't engage so much with politics yet, but would be really added value if they would?
Interesting question. What defines, is it my microphone that's giving the feedback?
Or is it mine? Maybe it's mine.
I'll step away. Maybe that will help. So I think there are many people with a technical background that are interested in politics, but maybe they need to be made aware of that. In Delft, you see quite often that people have discussions on what is going on in the news, and they can be quite critical on how that is handled, because clearly this is the best solution, for example. But then they don't necessarily take the next step to enter those discussions on a higher level, to enter the political debate, because they're more focused on what they're doing at that time. They're busy with their technical education, or they're busy with their technical research, or when they started their education to become a mechanical engineer, they imagined they would become a mechanical engineer. Well, they might be interested in those topics, so I think it's about facilitating events like these, trying to keep engaging them, and I'm not sure if it's the right way to do that through a curriculum. You see that it happens more and more in the curriculum, with a higher focus on sustainability, for example, a higher presence of ethics courses in the different educational programs. And then you already get those discussions between students more. But I think it's just about challenging people and see whether they're interested. And try and make them aware. Yeah.
So I'm perfectly in agreement with what you say as a response to Cynthia's question, but what I always tend to feel as a kind of disappointment is that, let's try to involve them more in the discussions. Well, it's not so much the discussion that I want to involve them in. I want to get them involved in trying to think about the solutions. So the political debate, or the political arena, so to speak, is very often a dispute that doesn't lead to consensus. That's one important aspect of the political arena, right, of the political context. But what I'd like to see is that students, even during their education, already understand what they can do, what they can mean, what the meaning is of their expertise for society at large, or a bit larger than their own group, without becoming a member of the city council, something like that. Not every engineer needs to become a member of the city council, but what they do need to learn, and that's why I think it should be in the curriculum, what they need to learn is that their expertise has an impact, one way or another, on what the world is going to be like, or a part of the world is going to be like. That's something that they need to be aware of. And depending on whether that, is accepted, or whether that leads to an engagement, then they'll, do something in politics, right? But I think that the first step is already very important for engineering students, or technology students to actually learn. So it's something that you can learn. Just like you've been raised in a certain way, and you had your early education in a certain way, that has developed your character. Now, this is the time to further develop your character in an academic way.
Yeah, I think an easy, or easy is maybe not the good word for it, but a way to realize this is to have, well, there are many group projects and in the different programs that study different situations. And it would be, I think more of these projects could be with real life situations in the city or in the country that the university is placed in. So you could say, well, architecture is a good example of a program already doing this. They take an area in the city and they say, what would you do if this building was demolished? What would you place there? How would you make it work in their environment? But when I look at my former program, mechanical engineering, the way that you learn how to do that is often just building a machine together that it has to fulfill some sort of assignment. So in my first year, I built a walking beer crate, which was of course very fun to do, but maybe not that applicable to society. And those projects can be varying in those regards, and I think it would be interesting to look at it that way. How can you make the projects that are handed out, how can you make them as applicable as possible to society, to see how it will actually work?
Yeah.
So it's more an intrinsic part of the program than just a single course on it.
Exactly.
And maybe regarding this, do we already have enough contact between municipalities and us regarding this? Because we, in the computer science curriculum, have projects that are given out by external supervisors. And I've now been trying to start it with the municipality of The Hague, for example, but I indeed never actually spoke to Delft. And if Delft does want some things, like, you have 10 more days for the software project this year, you can do that. But it's happening now. And also the master's projects, etc. I hardly see those parties. I see a lot of startups, I see companies. People want to go to companies, but I don't see the public sector so much present in those.
It varies a lot. Some parts of the governmental institutions are better at it. So for example, Amsterdam has a strong AI lab that maybe the TU Delft cooperates more with than they could do on a local level. And for many things, it just, somebody has to think about it and take action on that. Of course you can say, yeah, it would be interesting to do so. But handing either the governmental institutions that want to attract more engineers, they need to approach those engineers, and programs that want to be more invested in society need to approach society.
Yeah, so let me try to be a bit more controversial here, right? So what would a technical university like the one in Delft here, or Eindhoven, or whatever, any of the 4 technical universities that we have, what would they be if they are not meant to be a source of understanding what to do if you set yourself this goal as a society? I mean, it seems to imply that there's knowledge, and the knowledge is present in the universities somehow, and we kind of transfer that knowledge, some skills, to the next generation of students, the next generation of engineers, say, here, right? And then there's the practical context out there that they will get to understand once they get immersed in that practical context, with all the contingencies and the obstacles and strange things going on, people behaving like people, God forbid, right? So would it not be much better? This is an experiment, right? Would it not be a fantastic experiment just to show how the technical universities, including Delft, of course, has a role to play in trying to come up with the ways that we can solve all kinds of solutions, right? So why don't we have the solutions? Maybe we do have the solutions to, realize a much more sustainable society.
Yeah, those solutions are definitely being researched, and I think what you speak about is a bit of a tension that you have at a university. In the end, at a university, you are educated to go into academics.
Why?
That's the way the program is.
But what percentage of students is actually going into academics after their educational program?
Especially in Delft, it's very low, I think.
It's very?
Low.
Low, exactly. That's my point. So what are we teaching them? What are we teaching you?
To
to become Well, a researcher?
The balance differs, but in the end, you are the final thing that you have to hand in is a thesis. You have to do scientific research. That is what you are taught at a university, and of course, this scientific research can apply to society, but sometimes it can be very focused on minute details.
Yeah, so I think this
What?
does depend
Yeah,
for curriculum.
sorry.
So in the computer science,
you're partly responsible for the curriculum. So
in the bachelors of computer science, they're taught to be practical. That project I was just speaking about, that you can still propose for, it's a second-year project. We throw them out. They have to get something from someone else, and if the people outside don't even understand what they're asking for, that's part of the deal.
Right.
So we do that. So I don't mind it so much. The only issue there is that I see startups, I see the big tech parties there, and I don't see the public sector there. And that is a problem, I think, because we have 500 students a year coming in, being taught like this, but they don't enter. Even on top of that, many of our students are international, and the public sector isn't quite as international yet. Other issue, it excludes a lot of people to potentially collaborate too. So those are, I think, things we should think of. But in our particular corner of the curriculum, I'm not too worried about the practical side. But it depends on where you are, probably.
What I really find kind of characteristic is that even Twan is thinking of his education as there's this capstone, which is a thesis, and you show them that you actually can do the scientific research, which is of course important, I'm not denying that, but it gives you the kind of feeling that that is the goal of the educational program. And I'm kind of pushing here the point that that should not be the only goal of an educational academic program. We want you to understand science, to be able to do your own scientific research, but we want to turn you into a real academic that goes out into the world after your educational program and make your expertise relevant for a larger group of people.
All right. Fine. Can I give you the opportunity, since you've been quizzed by Herman, can I give you the opportunity to fight back and ask
he
him
can handle
a question?
that.
Yes.
Yeah. No issue there. Yeah. So you spoke about engineers having to gain the skill or the insight into psychology, and I was very curious to hear what you would find a concrete example of that lacking at this moment in time.
So the kind of things that I try to imagine myself is to just like we try to learn our students a bit more technology, just like one of the audience members said. I think it would be a good idea to, for instance, understand a bias like overconfidence. So it would be a good thing for engineering students to understand that every human being, including engineers, have this bias that we call overconfidence. That is to say that if you have the knowledge, you're overly confident that you are right? Mm-hmm. And if you understand that, then hopefully that has an effect on, the negative implications of overconfidence. So that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to get across.
Would you then agree that this would be taught by integrating societal context more into the program, aside from having a course specifically on that psychology?
Yeah, I'm absolutely defending the idea that it should be done in an integrated way, which is not easy, and it does cost time and money, but I think it's the next step that we should take in order to improve the academic educational landscape. Yeah.
That's a very great bridge to a question I wanted to ask the three of you before we move to some more discussion with the audience. And the question is the following. In the beginning, I asked you whether you all believe that we should have more engineers in politics, and most of you said yes. Now, when I was a kid, I used to ask my father. My father was a bit in politics, and I was asking him, but why do we need politicians, right? Why can't we have, as a Ministry of the Interior, a policeman? As a Ministry of Healthcare, a doctor, because they know how things are. And my father was replying, no, this would be technocracy. And what's wrong with technocracy? is, I think, part of the answer to the question why we don't want too many engineers in politics. So I would like to ask you some reflection on, aren't we risking to go into a technocratic dystopian state by having too many technical people in politics, especially at the level of the decision making? And let's start from Cynthia this time.
Well, I think that between a technocracy and a dystopy, there still is a bit of space, right? I mean, I think that the fact that Italy the fact that Italy got through Corona in a reasonable way was the fact that you had a technocratic government, I'd say. Because there, your prime minister wasn't challenged with elections coming up.
Correct.
So I would even say there isn't. I don't think technocracy is a bad thing per se. Of course, there we shouldn't be overconfident of our own things, but that's more about maybe humility as a value, more than about whether you know what you're speaking about. So I don't mind technocracy as long as it doesn't turn into a dystopy.
Right, but I mean, the example of Italy is that it was supposed to be an emergency, and Italy is kind of a very specific political country, so I guess we can have another meeting about Italian politics if you want. But, but I mean, the point is I don't want the technocratic government to be there forever, because I do want politicians to be responsive to the audience,
absolutely,
et cetera,
but then again, I think it was a nice illustration of comparing it really to what we saw in the Netherlands or other places that had elections. Really, in everything I saw happening there, it was about one of the most organized collective types of responses we saw, maybe because that aspect wasn't in there. So I agree that maybe it shouldn't also be the status quo, maybe you want it in certain cases, but like topics what I'm talking about, I think you need to be technocratic then in digitization, otherwise you get these issues with people not understanding. And if we get it, maybe then we can leave it to normal types of...
So I guess a follow-up question would be then, now, we're all interested in technology because we are at Delft, in a technical university, etc. But just imagine for a moment that now we are in a conservatory, or in a pedagogical university, or in a philosophy university. Wouldn't we be doing exactly the same reasoning and say, hey, we need more musicians in politics because politicians don't understand the real value of music? Or, hey, we need more philosophers because they don't understand the real value of philosophy. So what's so special about technology as opposed to any other form of knowledge that politicians should be taking into consideration?
Yeah, so I would argue it's really more about the way of thinking, the systems thinking, the more practical methodological mindset. It shouldn't even matter so much which degree you took out here. Like maybe the reasons what I spoke to you about before, to have culture being a priority or not in the government, is much more about what value is than about whether I play Mozart, right? And that's where being able to make those types of abstractions or seeing problems in that holistic way, there is something in the way we teach engineers that is special regarding this, that we don't see with others. And indeed, maybe also the forward thinking there, that we hear, like, indeed, engineers try to make new things and innovate. It's so much in the blood of these people, and it's so much maybe not in other types of education, that you shouldn't only do that.
Right.
But to counterbalance the pulling back, a bit of that maybe is needed.
Thank you.
It comes down to the balance.
Right. Right. So you wouldn't like even a municipality council with all engineers, or would you?
I think it would be very gezellig.
Right. For you, but how about society?
But in the end, you need a balance of these different approaches. And for now, in some areas, there could be a larger degree of engineering analytical approach. That pragmatism can really help in certain situations where it's now missing.
Herman, what do you think? Do we ever still a risk of technocracy, or people who are concerned about technocracy are totally in the wrong place?
No. I think that there should be a concern, right? So we should be on our guard for too much technology, and technology taking over in a technocratic way. But of course, I would not like to live in a world without music, or in a world without philosophy, etc., etc. But our society has become so complex that technology is much more important to have than ultimately anything else, really. I'm kind of stressing this point, and maybe I'm exaggerating here a bit, but I think that if you look at the complexity of our society, we desperately need engineers. We desperately need the technology, right? But of course, that's not to say that we don't need music or that we don't need philosophers as well. But you know, in the pandemic crisis, what we saw here is that in the first response to an immediate health crisis was to make sure that you understand what it means for a virus to spread.
Sure.
So it kind of shows you, it illustrates how important it is to have some kind of control over your environment before you start philosophizing or playing the piano.
Indeed. Even though now we are coping with what it meant to be locked up for 2 years, which is very much also a psychological and sociological issue.
Yes.
Right?
So this was the initial reaction to a pandemic, but of course there's more to it than just the spreading of the virus, which causes disease and deaths.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And luckily, hopefully, we've learned from this that we should take a look at those other aspects earlier or sooner, right? Yeah.
Anyway, speaking of that, I don't know about you, but I'm enjoying this conversation in person so much. I haven't been at university for almost 2 years. Just started teaching this quarter. Feels so good to be here and talking to real people. So that said, you real people over there, more questions to our speakers. Yes, please, 1 and then 2. And then whoever else wants.
Yeah, I would like to make a counter argument, especially about Corona. At the beginning, for example, when you had a funeral, someone died, or you had old people who were locked up, and these people were, for example, already terminally sick. You had engineers or engineering kind of thinking, oh, we have a problem, virus is spreading, we need to stop this, we lock everyone up. And then there became a counter-argument, oh, maybe this is too much of a technical problem solution kind of thinking. We need more humanistic approach. Old people maybe don't care about dying as long as they can still see their family. Or with the energy transition, you have like an engineering approach. We need windmills, we place windmills, we just fix it now. Instead of, oh, maybe for the people living there, there is so much damage that they will resist. They will spread asbestos in the streets of the village in Groningen because it's so counter what their beliefs are. So that's my counter arguments for more engineering in politics. And I was wondering how you were looking at this.
You want me to respond? Yeah. So I think the examples that you gave are really relevant. So my guess would be that we learn from the pandemic and that we do things differently when it would happen, in case it would happen again. But I would still say that the kind of examples that you gave kind of illustrates and shows why there is a difference between politics and science. That's why we can still talk about politics and we can talk about science and how these two are related to one another, and how intimate the relation ought to be. Now, what we've learned is that more engineers or more technology or more technological expertise in politics, given the complexity of our society, would be a good thing. And we've experienced that in the past, that it is a good thing. It might be the case that if we develop this further, that we might get too much engineers or too many engineers in politics. This is what we try to explore, right? But it's important to have a democracy and politics over there, and science as serviceable, I would say, to the decisions that we make and the aims that we want to reach. Now, if the aim is, as a first response to the pandemic, if our aims are to prevent the elderly to die or to prevent other people to get seriously ill, and we know that this is the technique that will help you to realize those goals, then it's rational and reasonable and plausible to do it, to employ that technology.
But if I may follow up on this, actually, something that was really interesting during the corona pandemic, and I know there are lots of debates now, generally in the Netherlands, on this. Indeed, science and politics, and to what extent they are or aren't the same. We've almost today had this argument more about politics being about making choices, maybe science more about finding the right things, but a core thing in being an academic is actually still to doubt. You have something, you change it, you update it. And that part of being an academic has been really taken out in...
Well,
I mean, numbers have been used as excuses to make decisions because the scientists said so. No uncertainty margins considered, right?
There's always uncertainty, and there's always a problem that we don't know exactly.
Yeah.
But once you have, so in case of an emergency, once you have your goals, right, then you can look for the way to reach those goals. That's what we did as a first response to the pandemic. I don't see that there's anything wrong with that, except perhaps that we kind of held on to that kind of solution and to those kinds of goals a bit too long.
Yeah, but I'm even extending this more towards the more science communicative aspect of the story further down, that when policy changes happened, there was a lot of criticism that, let's say, the people in the press conferences said, look at this graph, now we open, now we close. And people looked at the numbers and were like, but the numbers are... And then they were like, yeah, but the scientists said it's fine. And there actually the doubt that the politicians had was kind of shifted to that the scientists then came with an answer, where they, of course, doubt too.
Yeah, but not in the same way.
No, but if then it turns out that indeed things don't quite work out the way they are, it's the scientists' fault almost, in how this is framed.
So
which might keep people from...
What I think we agree on is that the communication is very important.
Yeah.
And the communication about, especially in a crisis like this, is that you ought to explain, you need to explain the science, what the science says. So in the same way that Twan is experiencing his role in the city council, is that if you want to make your expertise relevant, you need to look for a way that expertise is indeed accepted as being relevant, as being part of the solution. Now, in order to understand that, you need to know more about the psychology of human beings.
Sure.
And I think that's where we agree. So you need to communicate in a good way. Now, the other point that you seem to raise is that science is also about being uncertain. Science is also about having an open mind. But to this, my response is always, so this is my problem with the extreme stimulation of critical thinking. Because if you teach students to unconditionally critically think, then you get these very awkward situations where you have to defend something that we are sure of, only because of the fact that there is something like an open mind. So my response here is like, you know, the famous phrase that it's good to have an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out. So the problem with critical thinking and with characterizing science as that's the place where there's always room for doubt, that is true, but not with regard to each and every thing that a scientist says or brings to bear.
All right. I'm curious to hear there are more questions. No, that's all right. There was a question there, and maybe if you have a follow-up later, because you didn't seem to be 100% convinced, but there will be time possibly. But now you had your question.
I have a question about the role of the universities. On your last slide, you had a cartoon that kind of seemed to illustrate the mistrust between the population and science, for example. And this will probably not be solved by getting engineers into politics. And I think the two major problems are probably representation in politics and understanding. So if we're talking about asking better questions and we teach engineers the basics of politics and political science students the basics of engineering, then we're still left with the question like, who is responsible for educating non-academics to be able to ask better questions? And I'm wondering whether that's a role for the university, also provide basic education for people outside the university.
Nice question. Is it for Herman or for all of them? Shall we start for Tuan this time, since they have already been discussing this? You want to try and give a first answer?
Big question.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's why we're here.
This is also part of finding a balance of representation. So we spoke about the balance between non-technical people and technical people. But when you look at the composition of our parliament, for example, 90% of them have college education. And you can wonder, and 10% do not. And it is an important question to think about whether this is the right amount of representation, because that's not what society looks like. But at the same time, you also have the balance with what somebody in parliament or on the city council or another government body does. The approaches that you use there, they might be more academic. Just something that I ponder about when I think about this representation case. You want to represent everybody, and for that you need to communicate with each other, but does everybody need to be there to represent their group?
I think, Cynthia, you already said something in your presentation about our responsibility of academics also to talk to outside academia. So maybe you can say something.
So I myself did do quite a bit on public outreach. It is tricky because indeed, in terms of my normal hours and projects and time, I'm not really supposed to do it. And to do it right actually costs a lot of time. But I do feel it's important. I think many of us feel important for a lot of reasons. I think the most obvious reason, maybe even for TU Delft to send us out, was maybe more to attract actually prospective students. So then you'd go more into schools and talk to them, although you will raise the awareness by doing that. But media appearances, we do have quite a few of us who are engaged on that, or who are in the Rhododexes, to call it that way. Maybe that's not just something for a university on its own, but more for, again, a network of people who, like the ones who feel like going into politics, feel like doing this. So I think several of us do this, and yeah, we could do more. I think university can maybe more visibly appreciate it more, but it's there, and we are, I think, well networked. I mean, in Delft, I think we are very well networked into the city. Also with the science center, of course, that's there, that really speaks to a broader audience, also with festivals or whatever is in town. So we do well on that, I think, and also in terms of being visible elsewhere, yeah, the festivals, the events, they'll find us.
And Herman, is it right that Hazi was suggesting that more engineers in politics could be self-defeating, creating even more skepticism towards science and technology?
Well, I don't know whether that was your question, but I do think that what you're suggesting is a good thing. So what you're suggesting is that should the university not have as a task to open up the doors, to spread the kind of expertise that we have, to translate it to the level that everyone can understand it, young people, elderly people, etc., people with different backgrounds, etc., etc. It would be a good thing. We know it would be a good thing if everyone is updated with the latest ideas and that we have on how we can best try to solve the problems that we are facing. So I think you're absolutely right.
Then again, even in terms of how to realize these things, again, thinking about visibility or engagement, I was just now speaking about my own perspective, but of course, there's much more skill in our students, and we hardly do that yet, I think. So maybe indeed thinking of ways more to even have the student population engaging more with the people on these types of matters, beyond the projects you do for education. It would be really cool if people would be interested in taking that up.
Yeah. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Anna. So I study geosciences, earth sciences, so I think this debate is incredibly important for people from my study. Although I remember from the very beginning, you mentioned how ethics is not too useful for engineers over psychology. And because in my curriculum we had one afternoon of ethics, which I think it's way too little for someone who deals with Earth resources, I wonder what would you respond in the context of, well, Earth resources?
What I would respond, or?
Yeah, how would you answer to the discussion between psychology and ethics?
Yeah. So we were discussing in the break with Herman about that, and we kind of agreed that we need both, and ethics without a solid understanding of human psychology is old school ethics, is so-called armchair philosophy, where we build theory without really knowing how human mind works, how society works, etc. But that said, I do strongly believe that's a pity. Only one afternoon. How is this possible? So I need to talk to the dean of your faculty. That's not supposed to be like that. Anyway, so we usually have at least one course in each curriculum, which is still little, but at least better than one afternoon. So usually it's a course across one quarter. So yeah, I do believe that in general, I'm not necessarily a super big fan of ethics per se, but I do believe, well, even though it's my job, so I make a living with it, but I do believe humanities in general. So be that social science, be that art, anything that keeps you thinking it, getting out of the technical framing where everything is measurable or as the illusion of being, solvable. Because the other word I was thinking together with technocracy is solutionism. This idea that everything can be turned into a problem with a clear process and a clear solution, right? So I think any discipline that can get you out from that and problematizing things and thinking of the framing. So cognitive psychology is one entry point because you think about your biases. Philosophy is another entry point because you think about the theories. So I'm not necessarily big. History is another fantastic one. We don't have much in Delft. We should have more. Thinking how did we get here is a fantastic way to understand that things do not happen, like that and stuff like that. So honestly, I would like to have more over everything coming from the humanities here, if possible.
So just to make sure, my critical remark with regard to ethics concerns the classical ethical theories, be it Aristotelian virtue ethics or utilitarianism or deontological ethics or duty ethics. These are the kinds of ethical theories that do not correspond with the things we know through science is the case in the world that we live in and the kind of beings that we are. So that is my critical remark. So my critical remark would not be, do not think about moral issues. My remark would be, do think about moral issues, but take into account everything we already know about the world that we live in and about ourselves. That is something that maybe comes across quicker if you delve into psychology. Yeah. But history is also a wonderful way to go. Philosophy, I don't know.
Even though you cannot understand how a legal system works without deontological ethics.
Yeah.
So for instance, so anyway. Yeah. All right, any other questions? Do you want to try and get a second? You're fine, okay. Okay. Yes, please. There's a question over there. Thank you, Lester.
Yeah, so I have a question for Twan. So in your talk, you talked about the students at Delft, the graduates, how they don't have political ambitions at the top of their list when they leave and they go to the job market. And I imagine you probably have many friends, many would you say, studiegenoten, who you talk about politics with. Maybe they have an interest in politics, but they don't choose the political career. And I was just wondering, well, when I talk to my friends and I look at my own list, usually at the top is what I like to do, what I think I would be good at, and generally also what pays well. So what do you think is the biggest deterrent? Why are people not choosing the political career? What is the reason that they value other jobs higher?
I think, of course, the easy answer would be that it differs for everyone. What are their intrinsic motivations to go to work? Some people might just want a paycheck so they can do what they really like in the weekends. somebody can be just motivated by their skill set, the one that they've been taught. Let's say you've been taught in jet propulsion. Instead of thinking, well, that's a very complex system, where can I find other complex systems like that? You just go to, well, airplane engine maintenance, and you become an engineer there. I think it's, well, it comes back to considering it as an option. And I think many people do not yet consider it as an option. So it just needs to be there on the menu, so to say.
Yeah, but why is that? Why don't they see it as an option?
Well, when you think about, I don't know what program you follow.
Applied mathematics.
Applied mathematics. And your study association probably organizes many lecture talks and events. How many of those would you say are political in nature?
I mean, there's probably some that involve policy making, but I'm not sure many of them are actually political in nature. I don't think so.
So that becomes, so that goes back to us as students, us as engineers, and also those companies, institutions, governmental bodies, considering it an option, having it on the menu. The standard view for politicians is somebody who's studied law, or history of art is always a funny example. Don't know why that makes you a good politician. But many of them have studied it. And for us, the standard response is to go into engineering or into business.
Yeah, I also want to respond on this, because I think it goes even further to than only it's not on the list for students, but also not shown in a positive light in faculties. I study industrial design engineering, and I had a course about sustainability, and it was talked about policy, of course, because that's important for sustainability, but it was said in a way like, oh, there is policy, you need to design in a certain way because of that policy, and make sure that in your designing you're as sustainably as possible. And that really annoyed me, because I was like, but wait, we have knowledge right now in this course about how we can make the world more sustainable, but it is not said, oh, use your knowledge to actually change the policy. But it was said, no, the policymakers do that, and you as an engineer, you're going to design and just be fine with the policy and just design your little thing. So I think that is sort of a thing of the university.
I think it's about time to go, and I want to take 10 more seconds to say thank you for all the nice questions and discussion, but especially thank you to Herman, Cynthia, and Tuan for coming here and discussing with us. So thank you so much, and applause for you.